Irene says, when I ask what he values in people, he says competence. He needs someone as good or better than him. Does it mean I'm not good enough for him? Yeah, it's really interesting, Irene, because you are also at a crossroads here, right? You're like, what should I make this mean, right? And it's interesting. One of the things I want you to think about is the fact that whenever, a lot of women out there, and I'm sure you're probably the only woman out here, that does this. But when something happens, notice how you go to the worst case scenario, right? The worst case scenario is I'm not good enough for him, right? And this could mean anything. It could mean a whole bunch of different things, right? It could mean he could be talking about friendships. He could be talking about like what we were talking about earlier, where a guy says that he wants one thing, but ends up with somebody else because of his emotions, right? Generally speaking, most guys aren't looking for a woman who is trying to compete with him in a whole bunch of different areas, right? Like it's not all that attractive to most guys, right? It might be fun, it might be interesting, it might be a good thing to have in a buddy. But for a lot of guys out there, they aren't really looking for somebody who's like better than him at things that he's good at, right? And so that's something I think you ought to think about. And the other thing I think you ought to think about is not making it mean that you're not good enough for him, but instead finding out, instead changing the way that you think about yourself, so that instead of coming up with the idea that he thinks about me as not good enough. Instead, coming from a standpoint of, what if I'm incredibly attractive? What if, men are absolutely, feel like I'm irresistible to them? What, and coming from like mindsets like that, it's something I talk a lot about in my Forever Woman program, where I talk about changing the way that you think, so that when you interact with a guy, what ends up happening is you have a different way that you make things mean. And, if you come up to a guy and you start talking to him and he says something to you, and whatever, it doesn't matter what he says, and you think to yourself, does this mean that I'm not good enough for him? Right? Or if you make it mean something like, oh, he's creating a challenge for me, or, oh, he's trying to test me in some way, or, oh, he's really attracted to me, and so he's trying to come up with reasons why he's, like trying to, I don't know, whatever, right? Like maybe this is a bad example coming off the top of my head from this, but changing the way that you think about it, and coming from a standpoint of something that makes you feel more confident about yourself, rather than coming from a standpoint of making yourself feel worse about yourself. I think you'll do a lot better, not only with men, but in the rest of your entire life.
Matt, I actually had a question based on those two last questions. Seem to be, my man said this, does that mean he's thinking this about me? Do men communicate in those kind of cryptic ways? Because I know that for a woman, so I might say something like, oh, I really like flowers. And obviously I'm telling him to buy me flowers. That's how I communicate as a woman. But if a man says, I like flowers, maybe he's just saying that and it wasn't about me at all. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I'm asking you, do men communicate like that?
Sometimes they do. But it's not as often as women do. Right. So a guy might say something in a cryptic way because he doesn't want to hurt a woman's feelings. Right. And he doesn't want to get himself in trouble, or, a whole bunch of other things. Right. He might say things in a little bit more of a cryptic way. But, a lot of times it's women overthinking it. Like you can see in some of these comments that we have here, it's probably them just taking it and then, going somewhere else with it, which is really difficult not to do, right? Mm-hmm. If that's a habit of yours where you do that every time, right? Yeah. And so instead of just trying to not do it, in my opinion, it would be better to kind of do it in a different way, right? So instead of taking it and, going over here and being like, oh, it's this negative thing, taking it and going over here and saying, it's this thing that that empowers me, that makes my life better, that makes me feel better, you know, or, you know, at the very least kind of like brushes off my shoulder and
Right.
doesn't really impact me at all.
Cool.
So yeah. Yep.